Hey, barkeep, give me another beer. Sir, for the last time, this isn't a bar, and we're gonna have to ask you to leave. You're disturbing the customers. Throw me to the wayside like a dog. I'm used to it by now. Oh man, that movie was really something, man. Ford really knows his stuff. Yeah, Ford. It was so epic. Corny, more like. Hey, aren't you the guy who made that really racist movie? What the hell does some old racist fogey know about cinema? Cinema. I invented cinema. David Warwick Griffith was born on January 22nd, 1875, on a farm near Crestwood, Kentucky. His father, Jacob Griffith, fought in the Civil War, courageous in battle but not caring towards the young Griffith. He would die when Griffith was only 10, and leave behind as many debts that meant they must sell the family farm. One can imagine them, like the many other countrymen moving into the northern states, riding with what little they had packed into the developed Louisville, being heckled already by the shrill voice of street urchins in their raggedy clothes. It is from this starting point, a country hick in the big city, that we begin. Griffith, naturally intelligent, was allowed to skip 2 grades, and it's here in school he was introduced to the writer he would carry throughout his life, Charles Dickens. But, being pretty much poor, they could not afford his education for more than a few years, and at the age of 15 he was forced to seek full-time employment. At first a cash boy, then promoted to the elevator, he read on the job and attended plays after work, his ambition set on being a writer, but was held back by his age and the fact that he literally could not write. But if it would take some time to learn how to write, then for now he would take up the actor's plight. He took a job at the leading bookshop, where the town's most intelligent men gathered for nightly conversations, and a young Griffith stayed late to listen, enchanted by these up-class folks who could go on all night about some niche issue or interest. 3 years later, at the age of 21, his conservative mother was stunned when, ready for a serious theatrical attempt, he signed on with a touring company and took small roles wherever he could get them. At 24, with a few years of experience stored, and $19 in his drawers, he bought a ticket to New York. Here he would spend his days looking for work on the streets of Broadway, coming close to making them his home. Not because of any success, but because he quickly discovered that with his limited resources, he literally couldn't afford a hotel room. He found what's called a flop house that may have held 30 people a dorm, but had an attractive price of 15 cents per night. The next 9 years would be very difficult for the young Griffith. If the bookstore discussions in his hometown gave him an appreciation for the intelligentsia, the higher brow, then these years would put him in touch with the poor and suffering, and in a decade he would begin his life's work in attempting to intermediate between the two. Years of dedicated theater work later, and we find a wizened Griffith, still impressively passionate, but by no means a success. He has no established career in acting, a single play sold and many others rejected, and 1 poem published, but otherwise nothing. Now, some might say that at this point, it's time to give it up. But despite being 33, a failed actor, and a failed writer, one must keep in mind, as he would make very apparent in his later broadcasts and interviews, that Griffith, the man, has immeasurable confidence in his abilities. Griffith was still anticipating himself becoming a writer as he approached the movie studios of New York, and he managed to deliver some of his poems and published plays to the scenario writers at one of the struggling studios, Biograph. These would be dismissed out of the newspaperman mentality that the studios had at the time. However, he was hired as an actor. He was hesitant to take the offer at first, worried that acting for the movies was a waste of his talent and a betrayal of his theater friends. But any blows to his ego were overcome by the fact that he really needed a consistent paycheck at this point. It's his time here at Biograph where, in my opinion, his powers shine the brightest. Historians quibble about whether he actually invented the cinema tricks he claimed he did during this period, but that's not why these years are interesting. What's interesting is how he changed the entire mentality behind filmmaking. You see, you gotta understand that the word director didn't mean the same thing as it does today. None of the cameramen at Biograph felt that directors were even substantial members of the crew. They merely thought of them as allocating actors for a scene. Most people felt directorship was a demotion, if anything. In the early days, you had 2 types of people behind a production: the scenario writers and the technicians. The technicians were more or less day laborers. The only requirements for their job were energy, stamina, and a knowledge of the actors. It was Griffith, however, who was the first to revolutionize this, and it all started in the rat-infested rooms of the Biograph studio. His chance would come when the lead director fell ill, and Griffith was recommended to take his place. He begins churning out film, successfully, but is deeply unsatisfied with the job, feeling as if he's betrayed the theater. It paid well, it was steady, but to an immensely ambitious man, it was a job that needed to be dignified, needed to become artistic, to gain the respect of the intelligentsia, while still primarily appealing to the average Joe. Now, the basic funny fact about the medium of film is that your tools to achieve your art are a cast of other people, each with their own ideas and wills. So when you start wanting to convey more complicated ideas or achieve more subtle effects, it requires a bit of lighthearted psychological manipulation. Let's say you want your actors to be cheery, but they're just not in the mood for such an emotion. Griffith solved this by going for a walk and saying if they had it figured out by the time he was back, he would give them a $5 raise for the day. Simple, but it worked like a charm. Or, if a crew member starts suddenly causing a scene, challenging your authority. For Griffith, a knockout punch solved the problem. Having trouble getting an actress to register fear for an important shot? How about you fire a fucking gun without warning? Another one of his trademarks was insulting an actress's husband until she flew at him in a rage, then turning the camera on her. Between 1908 and 1913, Griffith made more than 400 short films for Biograph, turning the failing studio into a leading competitor. But short films were no longer enough. Increasingly lengthy and spectacular features were becoming common. By 1913, exhibitors began to move away from the tiny neighborhood Nickelodeons to larger film theaters charging an admission fee of 10 to 15 cents. In New York, the Regent and Strand theaters opened in 1914 as the first movie palaces that were to become so widespread. The movies were becoming lengthier and were being accepted as middle-class entertainment. Griffith felt that if he wanted to retain a position of leadership in the American film industry, he would have to start making feature films. The Biograph leadership did not sympathize, and so Griffith resorted to subterfuge. During his annual company pilgrimage to California in 1913, he began production of a feature-length film based on an old stage play in which he had appeared, Judith of Bethulia. Griffith's enthusiasm for the project was so infectious that he converted the Biograph accountant, J.C. Epping, sent to rein him in, and the film turned out to be a box office hit. So, Griffith pondered, then acted. He rushed to the office of J.J. Kennedy, Biograph's president, and for the first time ever, you had a director demanding full and complete authority over his work and a share of the profits. But his reception was chilly, and despite the immense work he had done for the company, Kennedy could promise Griffith nothing but a return to filming one-reel movies. And so the first true filmmaker left the Biograph after 5 momentous years. He cast about for new employment and finally found it with Harry Aitken, head of the Mutual Film Company. Shortly, most of Griffith's stable of actors and technicians joined him at Mutual. But short of funding, the Mutual bosses put Griffith to work filming a few inexpensive features, but it wasn't long until Griffith was deep in the planning stages of what he hoped might be his greatest film to date. Griffith, I've pulled you aside today to say how happy I am with our agreement. Your films are a hit. You should be proud. Yeah, I know. I'm gonna need $50,000 for the next one. $50,000, that's a lot of money. We could make a lot of other films with that. I'm telling you, this one is going to be worth 100 of the other films. Well, I'll see what I can do, but for now, let's stick to the smaller ones. Yes, that is what I will do. Listen, this guy is a genius. If he says he can turn a profit, then I say we give him a chance. Yes, but is he trustworthy? Oh, absolutely. All right, let's have the horses come in from the left. Perfect. Good. In fact, I bet you right now, he's planning out ways of lowering the cost. All right, keep coming, just like that. And you're fighting, fight. All right, I suppose we can give him some seed money and see how it goes. Good news, Griffith. We've got some funding for you. Oh, nice. That's, Is that what I think it is? Oh, God. Please tell me you have a script at least. We should really talk. Birth of a Nation. based on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman, tells the turbulent story of American history in the 1860s, as it follows the fictional lives of two families from the North and the South. Throughout its 3 hours, African Americans are portrayed as brutish, lazy, morally degenerate, and dangerous. The KKK rises up to save the South from the Reconstruction-era prominence of African Americans in Southern public life. The film is a cinematic triumph and a horrifying piece of racist hate. There are two ways of talking about the film, either totally disregarding the content to focus on the innovations, or disregarding the innovations because of the subject matter. Easy as it is to say, this film is a triumph, shame about the politics, and thus appreciate the good and ignore the bad of the film and carry on with our days, this is impossible when actually watching it. The innovations are intrinsically tied to the content, and thus a load of narrative film conventions are tied to hatred. There's tons of examples of this throughout the film, but Neil's review breaks this down further and much more eloquently than me, so I've linked it in the description. The film made around $11 million, with a budget that ended up being about $110,000, which is an insane profit for 1915. Following this massive success, Griffith was immensely confident, but the next picture he made, Intolerance, did not do as well, and the following ones would do even worse. Griffith would continue to pour his own money into making his failing pictures. Confidence turned to overbearing, almost paranoid control. He would slowly lose his creative liberty and start having to cater to audiences, strapped to the wheel of his debts and without any stable model of filmmaking to guarantee success. Eventually, he would lose his leadership position in the industry, become unemployable as a director, and end his life a drunken old man with nothing but pity from those who, in his opinion, owed their careers to him. Griffith's films are considered by some to be among the best the medium has to offer. Of course, they've been overcome today, but in a way, he did everything the medium could and would do. So I'm going to be focusing here just on what we can learn from the films he made for Biograph. The idea that he invented the following techniques has largely been disproven, but what he did do is use them to craft emotional effects. If we see Méliès and his contemporaries as inventing a bag of tricks, a bunch of fun colors for the kids to play with, then Griffith is a humorless kid who tries to make the Mona Lisa with them. If he ever uses invisible wires, it's only to enhance a scene while remaining realistic, like this clip where he's manipulating the barrel with fishing poles. If he uses the stop substitution, it would be for something as subtle as changing the lighting to convey a changing mood. He uses masking quite a bit, but it's always either to enhance a feeling, like the feeling of claustrophobia here, or to simulate a point of view. We'll start with a simple trick, the pan shot. A pan is when the camera is rotated horizontally. It had been a staple of documentary and fiction films long before Griffith picked it up, and the simple version is something like this, where you're just showing the scenery. But in The Call of the Wild, Griffith invested this type of shot with expressive overtones. Here the camera slowly follows this man creeping in a woman's garden. It comes to rest at the gate as the girl and her husband emerges, the man at the left edge of the frame, as if he's a lurking menace to the two. Then, we follow them as the pan reverses, staying close to the action and emphasizing the proximity of the two. It makes the scene much more intense than if it had been a single far shot. Another example uses it for quite a different effect. Here the camera pans forward as a man exits the house. Then, it pans back as he returns to retrieve something, and leaves once more. Thus, the camera itself seems confused and indecisive as a man's direction. Now we have the basic idea. What if we combine the two? We can take the tension from the first clip by making it a chase scene. Then add the idea of panning to show confusion to heighten the tension, having the pursuer almost walk out of frame, then pan back as he figures it out. Since we already have the pan, the next step is to make the camera itself move. He would move the camera slightly in the shorts, but the coolest use of tracking shots is here in the feature-length film Intolerance, when he would use cranes and air balloons to track an epic choreographed sequence. While it's no crane, technically a moving shot from inside of the car would work just as well. And we can add a little bit of drama to make it interesting. It's a cool trick, but to put it to use, we really need the next step, which is Griffith's bread and butter, parallel intercutting. Intercutting allows us to use two shots to show the same thing, usually from different viewpoints. So using the scene with the pan shot we already have, we can add another perspective, thus showing the same span of time from two different points in space. This would give us a very primitive version of the intercut. But by inserting parts of the second clip into the first at certain points, we can create the illusion of simultaneity and make the two perspectives parallel in time. Griffith would rely on this heavily to give tension to his chase scenes, cutting between a damsel in distress and some heroic figure on his way to save her. As he grinded out the shorts for Biograph, he came to master the technique, expanding its range to everything from comedies to political statements, and in the process establishing one of the largest pillars of the language of film. For the final trick, we're going to look at how Griffith uses the close-up. Griffith first uses the close-up in this film, betrayed by a handprint, in order to show more clearly elements of the plot, elements that are not large enough to be communicated through a wider shot. Without any background distractions competing for our attention, our interest can be directed towards something as subtle as the movement of hands or the writing on a sheet of paper. But these are strictly functional and add no emotional content to the film. The next step is to take this simple idea of directing attention towards some object and make that object an actor's face. So when we're constructing a chase scene, not only is there the tension from cutting between different perspectives that we got from parallel editing, but now, instead of having actors flail their arms around, we can show the subtle play of expressions on the damsel's face, from danger to relief. Then, combine this with the circular masking, and by the time you get to Birth of a Nation, he's conveying things as complicated as falling in love. And with that, I think we have enough to cut together our very own D.W. Griffith chase sequence.